Hey guys, welcome to another Shut Up Already. I recently had a request about doing one of these on handle shaping. This is something I get asked about a whole lot, and I've never really known how to do like a proper, I guess, tutorial or whatever, just to kind of go through my process. You know, everyone's process is going to be different. But today I had a whole bunch of knives that all had basically the same handle, and so I finished one each at a different stage, and I thought that'd be a perfect opportunity to show you guys kind of my progression of how I shape a handle. Like I said, I've never seen anybody do anything like this before. I just kind of developed this myself over a long period of time. I do the majority of my shaping now on my 2x72 grinder. I started with the little 4x36 that you guys have probably seen before, and even before that I used to shape the handles with my angle grinder and a flap disc. I would clamp my knife in a vise and work the angle grinder around it. And you know, whatever works for you. You can shape a whole handle with files. That's a nice, slow, easy way to do it. The thing about one of these guys is you can make mistakes really fast. So you know, just take it easy. Slow and steady is going to win this race. So I'll just get right into it. So this is what my handles look like straight out of the clamps. You got some over squeeze there. I try to cut them pretty close just to kind of eliminate some of the shaping that I have to do with the grinder, but I definitely leave myself a little bit of room, probably an eighth of an inch overall on the width. I give myself, just, you know, give yourself some room to screw up, and so that's what they look like. Pretty rough, straight out of the clamps. My next step, I go around the whole thing, and I find the tang around the whole blade just to get that profile. And I should mention, this is for obviously a full tang knife. For a hidden tang, it's a little bit different. You don't have that to kind of go by, but that's the same thing I do. Is I start with this profile because that's what I'm comfortable with working with full tang knives, and then I go to shaping it this way. So that'll be my first step, and I'll grind it down. I'll work around it, my grinder this way, and also you can use your little contact wheels. Always keep the handle moving. Don't sit there and stop in one spot. You're going to make a big burn mark, and you'll gum up your belt pretty good doing that. But mostly I'm working sideways just to find the tang, waiting for the sparks, and then I'll clean up around the tang so you can see, maybe not, just in here, my grind marks are perpendicular to my tang. Everywhere else, it's all, the grind marks go with it, and that's kind of how you want to finish. But in here, it's just too tight for me to get to on my wheel, but I clean that stuff up later. So from there, I like to start with the knife blade upside down, and I'll come in and work my profile on the one side. And like I say, I'll go really slow. You don't want to mess anything up. You don't want to gouge anything because you can't put material back on these things. But I'll find my shape along the bottom first, and I'm keeping an eye on the top too, and you know, constantly flipping over and watching the top. But I'll initially just take out like the main meat where I know I want to lose a bunch of material along this corner. So I'll shave that off and then just kind of work my shape on the one side. And then what I end up with is something like this. So I've got, this is better. So I'll end up with, you know, half of it shaped. And it's rough, it's not perfect, but it's as close as I can get it for now, just to kind of give myself an eyeball for the other side. And that's, yeah, just kind of work it down, go nice and slow and steady. And then I'll do the other side. And once I've got the other side done, you know, I'm kind of eyeballing symmetrical, but I think I can get pretty close that way these days. And I'm always, you know, making sure that I keep the tang clean, keeping my grind lines running parallel with the tang. And then at that point we're pretty sweet on the shape mainly. You know, I'm always checking it, making sure it feels good. Then I will go around and smooth the whole thing up. So I'll start with this area here, right on the belt. Mainly that's just cleaning up both the grind lines I don't know if you'll be able to see, but it's pretty rough and gross, right? So you want to clean that up, getting all your lines, all your sanding lines going with the grain, and also especially your pin heads. You want to make sure you clean those up because they're really rough right now too. And then I'll kind of work around this a little while, again, constantly moving it, and then I will take down this edge here. For my handles, I like to shape everything really ergonomic, pretty smooth. I don't like to have anywhere on the knife where I can feel anything sticking into my hand, like this hard 90-degree edge. I don't want anything like that. I want it to be nice and smooth, because if you're using this thing for hours, you're going to get blisters if there's anything rubbing like that. So I like to go nice and smooth. Once I've got that kind of broken down, then I'll come along on my belt and just kind of smooth the whole thing out, getting all my sanding lines as much as I can at this point, running with the grain of the wood, and just kind of rolling it over, kind of constantly moving it. If you're doing this, you want to be careful you're not gouging into your spine, and you want to make sure you watch this area here. As you're coming in, if you're trying to smooth this up, you come in, you can easily catch your ricasso here with the edge of your belt, and you don't want to do that. It'll mess things up big time. So once I do that, then it looks like this. Pretty nice and smooth, nice and round. For the most part, I've got everything kind of smoothed out. There's still going to be a couple little bumps in there, a couple of spots where it's not quite smooth. That's fine. After this, we go on to, by the way, this is I do most of my shaping on a 60 grit belt. After this, I'll move to the 120, but you'll see the pins are nice and smooth. All the grind lines are even. Again, this isn't quite cleaned up yet, but that's okay. We can get to that later. And all the way around is nice and smooth. Then I move up to, I usually go right to a 220 after the 60, depending on the species, but usually I go right to the 220. And then I'll do the same thing. Going over the whole thing, just like keeping everything moving. I go around the whole tang, make sure that I clean that whole thing up and get it, all the rough marks from the 60 grit up to a 220. And yeah, just kind of going around the whole thing, trying to make sure I don't dig in anywhere, because now all my shaping's pretty much done, rough shaping anyway. So I don't want to dig in anywhere and have to clean that up or fix that. So I'm just going nice and slow and steady. And I'll also take off these hard 90 edges here, and I'll even clean up a little bit in there. So once I've got that done, it looks like this. Basically the same as the other one, but a little bit smoother. And so these are cleaned up here, and everything's starting to feel nice and smooth, like a handle. My pins are nice and clean, up to a 220 grit. Keep an eye on those. All the way around my tang is up to a 220 grit, and everything's looking nice. And then it's the hand sanding. But first, I'll put this in my vise, and I'll clean this up with a Dremel. A lot of guys will have like a tiny wheel attachment for their belt grinder, and they can get in there. I don't have one of those, so I go at it with a Dremel by hand. And I'll also take off these hard 90-degree edges on the side of the kind of finger guard there, just so there's nothing harsh on your finger there. So I'll smooth those up all by hand, clean this up, and then hand sand. Now when I hand sand, I usually start at a 220 grit, because that's where most of the handle is at now. If there's anything major that I didn't really see on the grinder that I kind of want to adjust as far as shape goes, maybe I'll start a little lower, but generally I'll start with a 220 and just clean everything up, take off any of the burn marks, take off any of the hard edges that are left, and just really smooth the whole thing out and get everything up to that nice smooth 220. Always checking it, making sure, because sometimes there's something you don't see but you will feel. And so I'll go to 220 and then up from there. Depending on the species of handle or whatever material you're using for a handle material, that will dictate kind of how high you want to go in grits. This, should have mentioned, these are half walnut and half hickory. That's a pretty basic handle material. So I'll stop these ones at about 600 grit. But if you're not sure about the handle material you're using, like sometimes if you go with a Koa, you go up to like even 2000, 2500 grit. Basically go until the material stops looking better with every grit. These guys, you won't get much more out of them after a 600, but if you keep going with something like an ironwood or, you know, Cocobolo rosewoods, those kinds of things, even micartas, depending on how smooth you want your finish, and yeah, some of those really cool exotic woods will just keep getting better and better with every grit. So keep going until it stops looking better. That's basically that. And as you're sanding, I keep sanding with the grain. Coming from woodworking, I've always been taught you always sand with the grain. You always see guys with their knife clamped up and they've got a long skinny strip and they're working it around the blade. I guess that rounds things, but that's counter to what I've always been taught. I mean, I guess as long as your final sand is with the grain, then you're fine, but I always just sand with the grain because that's just what I know. So with each grit, you're just trying to make it look a little bit better. You're trying to get rid of all the scratch marks from the previous grit and just keep moving up. Make sure you get your spine up to the same grit, the whole spine up to the same grit that your tang is at all the way through here. And definitely pay attention to your pins because they're going to be probably harder than your wood. So make sure you get those nice and smooth. One thing about hand sanding, if you're sanding a softer material and you've got these hard pins, if you're hand sanding a lot, you will start to notice that your pins become a little bit proud. That's because they're just harder and you're not taking as much material off of those as the material around it. So you could use a hard block on your sanding paper to take that down, or a file or something if you have to correct that. So after hand sanding, this is up to a 600, all nice and smooth. There's no like weird dips or lumps or hard edges or anything like that. This is everybody's smooth all the way around there because it's a kitchen knife. This thing's going to be in someone's hand hopefully for a number of hours, so you want that thing to just be comfortable, and you don't want anywhere rough, anything going to be rubbing on the inside of that person's hand, because that'll just give them a blister. If some prep cook's chopping onions for 4 hours, you don't want them getting a blister or anything from any rough spot on your handle. So that's up to 600 all the way around. Once you're done, go over the whole thing with a really nice bright light. Like I got these LEDs, these flexible LEDs all over my shop. They're awesome. I put this thing under that and I look over the whole thing, particularly making sure my pins are nice and smooth, looking for any scratches I might have missed, especially right in here. Sometimes that's tough to get at with the sandpaper. Make sure that's all good. And then it's time to put on the oil. Long-time viewers will know I mainly use tung oil for my handles. I like it. There's lots of other ones you can use though that are just as good. A lot of guys will use True Oil, Danish oil. You can get boiled linseed oil. Works great for like axe handles and stuff. I used to use them on knife handles, but I find it darkens a lot of woods a little bit and doesn't really bring out the grain as much as a tung oil does. Apply a bunch of coats. Again, depending on the material, if you're using a really oily wood or a synthetic, then really oiling it's just basically cleaning off the dust. It's not really going to absorb anything, but stay away from anything that leaves a plasticky, shiny finish. Even if you're using all these other oils, make sure that you wipe off the excess, because you don't want like a shellac or anything like that left over on the outside of your handle, because that's just a plasticky coating that's going to give you blisters. You don't want that. And so once it's oiled, there's the finished product. So this one's hickory. My lighting in here is not conducive to filming with an iPhone, but that's it. All nice and smooth and finished. And that is Handle Shaping 101 by Mike Jones Knife and Tool. Thanks for watching.